Okay, hello and welcome to Minor Compositions. For tonight's conversation, we have a quite fun one, and I'm going to introduce this as being a conversation among, I think I can say, fairly old friends, not just because we're also all literally old, but because we've known each other for actually a fair bit of time. So tonight we have along Richard Gilman-Opalsky and Bruno Gulli. So thanks for coming along, both of you.
Pleasure to be here. Thank
Thank
you.
Now,
you. Yes.
if I remember correctly, the first time I met you, Richard, or had a long conversation was in a car going from Vermont back to New York. And then I don't think I met Bruno around the same time, but I think I like first contacted with Bruno um where after Labor of Fire came out, and we
Yeah.
had a chat. And I remember you being like, "Yeah, this is part of my three-part trilogy." And I was like, "Oh, that's impressive." And so I've read a lot of your stuff. And actually published what, two books or several books, I think, by Richard. Anyways, we've known each other for a long time, so there's a
Yeah.
lot of stuff where, in theory, we're talking about one book tonight, Communist Ontologies, which came out, what, a year or so ago? Was it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And
Yeah, but
um,
we might get lost and end up talking about not any number of things, and that's part of the fun. Who knows where we'll end up? It'll be a intellectual psychogeography. But yeah, so let's start with this book because it's a fun book. And one thing I have to admit, and maybe this is one of my personal failures, is I'm still amazed how when you work on a book, how you, even though you read it 10 times, you don't really get to read it until it's out, and then you actually read it, like not reading it as an editor, but actually reading it someone reading a book. And I go, oh, this is a lot of fun. Maybe fun is the wrong word, but it's quite an enjoyable book to read. And maybe I'll start with sort of a big picture thing. The way both of you talk about sort of communism, not as a political program, not as a set of demands, not as a sort of, a manifesto, but rather as a form of life. And I really like that framing because I think it's really productive. But can we just play around that for a little bit? Like, what does that shift mean to you? To shift it from thinking of communism as being a politics to being life forms itself.
Sure. So, I mean, I can start with this if that's okay.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so, I mean, first of all, I think that for Bruno and I, um, an ontological approach to communism does not necessarily mean a shift away from political economy. Um, the way that we think about Marx's focus on political economy, which is something that Bruno works on in Labor of Fire, a book that you mentioned already, is capitalist political economy necessitates a particular form of life, a particular approach to labor, productive labor, a particular approach to time. And when Bruno and I think about communism, and we think about it as it comes out of Marx's work, we see in Marx that his concern with capitalist political economy, his concern with industrializing society and mass production and poverty and inequality and other things, is there's a deeper cut. It's all ultimately about life. It's about the form of life that is necessitated by capitalist political economy. So when you think about Marx's project in terms of existing political economy and revolutionary transformation of political economy, that seems to me right. But what motivates an interest in political economy and its abolition, the abolition of the capitalist form, you have to make a deeper cut. It has to do with forms of life.
Mhm. Yes. Yeah, no, I completely agree, of course. And I was thinking of a wonderful passage from the economic and philosophical manuscripts. Now I can look for it and maybe read it, but it's precisely the distinction that is made there between, the human being as a worker and the human being is a human being, life, right? I mean, everything that is left out of the productivist logic of capital, which no longer counts anything, right? But which is recuperated precisely in communism as a form of life. Because I agree with Richard, and of course, political economy for Marx is always the critique of political economy, right? So the critique of the science of capital that reduces, right, the human being to a worker. And this is the problem precisely of the productivist logic. Again, the question is not production, right? I mean, of course, there is production. Again, in labor of fire, I go into that. Also, engage in the question of the concept of poiesis, right? Producing, I mean, bringing forth things that are not there. I mean, whether it's for use or then the artistic, I go into that also in labor of fire. And that's a problematic distinction in any case, mere work and artistic aesthetic production. But that's the idea that the productivist logic reduces everything to what is no longer a form of life, but it is a form of death. I mean, living labor that becomes capital is living labor that becomes dead labor, precisely. So the form of life is precisely eliminated by the productivist logic. So recuperating that, and certainly this cannot be done by thinking of communism as a form of government, as usually, historically has been the case, right? But instead recuperating the idea of what it means to live. That's basically what is often forgotten, right? In the politics that goes on, historically and today particularly. I mean, and think about the idea of having a political science, someone who is a political scientist, but who needs a political scientist, who needs political science. Politics is, even to go back to Aristotle, if you will, the famous, right, idea found both in politics and in the Nicomachean ethics in Aristotle, that the human being is a political animal, right? Zone, politikon. But what we usually forget to add, what Aristotle says in both books, is that the human being is a political animal by nature. Meaning that not being political is like not being human, right? So one cannot, eliminate the political element dimension in one's life without foregoing one's humanity as well. And this may link to the point that you also made, Stephen, in your draft today of the question of, and we may go into that, the question of humanity, humanism, and so on. Right? It is precisely that. I mean, the form of life is to understand the human being as a form of life among many other forms of life. And this is what is forgotten, but in a general, not only economy, but in general ecology of a being, this is what should be, be the focus again of political action, human action, daily life, because ultimately that's what it is. Politics as a form of life is precisely answers, if you will, the question of how to live. I mean, what is it to live, really? So, and this is something that is completely forgotten, but not, I mean, deliberately so. I mean, especially if we think today of, one interesting question is, the question precisely of communism as a form of government or any form of government for that, not, I mean, I mean, all of them, the question of who governs whom. And what is this thing that some people think that they can actually do that, rule over others, govern others? This is something that must be exploded altogether, right? And so this also has to do with the question of the subject. This, Stephen, you also point out in your paper today, right? I mean, the idea that we had to not only perhaps find a new form of government, a new form even of governance, but we had to forget about all this and find new ways of living, new ways of politically being together. But in that sense, the politics, again, that goes back to the original tradition of our politics as, um, precisely being together, the political sphere, if we want to use that expression, not in the traditional sense, but, politics as the extension even of, and not merely a mechanical extension, but the extension of, if you will, also what it is to live in biological terms. But there is no difference for the human being, at least living politically goes together with living biologically, right? I mean, biological life per se is no longer, I mean, it is a form of life, but that's not what we mean, right? So we don't have to, in other words, we don't have to move from biology to, to government in order to make the passage into politics. Politics is already there at the beginning of living together, right? So this is communism as a form of life is this an ungoverned way of living, not ungoverned altogether, maybe organically, a sense of self-discipline and so on. That's important, right? But not that there is this sovereign form, because really, the issue here is that of sovereignty. This is another paradigm that must be completely eliminated and must be exploded. So the paradigm of sovereignty and subjectivity.
Yeah.
So I don't know if, there is much more to say about this, but I hope that helps, initiating this type of conversation as well. Yeah.
One of the things I like is I actually didn't mean to start with such a sharp distinction between politics and ontology, at least the way I wrote my notes, but then I immediately fucked it up. But like a good jazz band, like Sun Ra says, if someone hits the wrong note, we all hit the wrong note, it becomes the right note. So thank you for sort of doing something more interesting with me messing that up. But what it makes me think what you're talking about is the way in which politics also is very much about the production of certain kinds of ways of being together. So I'm thinking about here, there's this famous Thatcher quote, and I apologize in advance for quoting Thatcher. Um, but I think it's for early age where she says something like, economics is the method, the goal is to change the soul. And there you have the idea that the political economy is just a sort of a set of tools in this case, to dissolve, to break apart ways of being together, to ways to break apart commonalities, unions, break apart any sense of we that is bigger than individuals and families, right? I mean, that's where she gets the famous line about sort of there is no such thing as society, just individuals and their families. There is nothing, any form of life which is bigger than an individual as a sort of economic individual agent must be destroyed. And so part of what you're doing, I think, philosophically is trying to reapproach that a different way, where we're thinking about sort of philosophy and political economy together, and almost like thinking about ways to think about forms of life which are bringing back forms of collectivity, but not the forms of collectivity that were claimed by, for instance, by top-down, state communist regimes, but rather thinking about collective beings which aren't that or are something else. Is that a fair reading?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
I think so. And if I could just add a couple of points, not much more than what's already been said, is, Bruno was talking about um, new forms of life, and of course that's part of the subtitle of our work. Um, and you were just talking, Stephen, about going back and retrieving certain things, not from the so-called communist projects of the 20th century, but maybe from other destinations. The thing that is crucial for us in this approach is that, and I think it's a crucial ontological premise, is that forms of life are subject to change, and that when we think ontologically about being, we must also think about becoming, and becoming what is not yet, which is a crucial part of the communist idea, right? Is that there always has to be the possibility for the abolition of the existing state of things, a phrase from the German ideology that Marx and Engels used to define communism that is really important to both Bruno and I. It's really about undoing what is and and understanding that forms of life that appear to be fixed can become unreal and new forms of life can emerge. So, a couple of examples, one past and one more present. One past is, Rosa Luxemburg wrote an essay called Of the Dissolution of Primitive Communism, which could be questioned and has been questioned as a piece of anthropological research. But she goes around and looks at what we would call sort of tribal or indigenous forms of life at different geographic locations, dating back to antiquity. And she starts with the German Mark form of community and says that these forms of life were not ideologically or self-consciously communist, obviously, but they were pre-capitalist forms of life that showed what Marx would call in Grundrisse a kind of naturally arisen communism, or that they had what maybe anarchists might have called a prefigurative communism, right? It's sort of a prefiguring a communism that for Luxemburg was destroyed by imperialism and slavery, and new forms of life become possible. The importance of that, I think, that essay is not so much how accurate it is from an anthropological point of view, but how it reveals that in politics, what is often declared impossible actually has a history of happening. And so some part of it is to go back and look at communist forms of life that even predate the philosophy of communism itself. But another part of it, if you look today at, for example, um, ontological questions surrounding gender, and recently you did a wonderful, or you, we, you wrote a review, Stephen, of Kira Kremen's book, The Spectral Woman, and she works on questions of transgender becoming. But the idea that someone's son would become a daughter, or a woman would become a man, not even that long ago, was from an ontological point of view considered impossible. Even though it was happening, of course, it was already always happening. But this idea has been exploded. That is to say, the ontological fixity of gender has been exploded, and everybody knows it. And so when we talk about being, we must also always talk about becoming. And I think as communists, for us, we always have to take sides with the possibility of the not yet.
Yes, and if I may, yeah, I'd like to say also something about being and becoming. I completely agree. Of course, we spoke about that often, Rich, you and I, and we wrote about that in the book as well. But must be always remembered that they always go together, that there is no being without becoming, becoming being an aspect of being. But that doesn't mean that it is an aspect among many. I mean, it's not an addition to what it means to speak about being, to also speak about becoming. There is no being without becoming, right? So, but very often ideologies of all types, including ideologies that attack the question of gender and so on, as you were saying, precisely try to fix everything in one box, in one category, and eliminate this very important moment of being, the becoming as the defacing, to use Stigler's language and Simon Don's language, really, Stigler speaking about Simon Don, the defacing of being, right? So they going through the trance, precisely, in a more, even a broader sense, the ontological sense of what it means to engage in a transductive mode without which there is no being, right, at all. So, and that's actually what Hegel already says in Science of Logic, right? The beginning cannot be made with a pure being or pure nothing, but it is becoming, right? So very often this is forgotten, or rather, it is used against precisely what it means to speak about forms of life, because forms of life are precisely those forms that transform, right? It's the transformation which is the main idea, even in the concept of form, right? The main motor of a form. A form cannot remain the same forever, right? It must change. So this is very important. And this is, in a sense, applied to political life, daily life, period, yields very important results, right? Because the reduction of everything to the economy, and then political and so on. But what is economy? After all, it's the oikos, the nomos, right? The nomos of the oikos, which is the law. We say the law of the house, of the dwelling place, but this nomos law, it's not law in the sense of the sovereign law superimposed on us. Nomos means the way in which things are run, the handling of things. So it is the way in which we handle our oikos, our environment, our milieu, right? Our dwelling place. That's what ultimately economy really is, and it is part, of course, of both, the political and the ethical task the human beings have, right? I mean, political because of what I said. Also, politics it cannot be dismissed because one dismisses humanity as a whole, and ethics the same because the ethos, right, according to also Heidegger's reading of Heraclitus, is precisely the dwelling place, right? Yeah.
Then it seems to me that there is or really could be a kind of important role in communist philosophy for anthropology. So I'm thinking here about not just new forms of life, but always be able to say, yes, this appears new, but oftentimes what we see as being new oftentimes actually relates to a form which has existed in many different societies, in many different cultures for thousands of years. I'm thinking here about new forms of gender, but you can also look at sort of various anthropological work upon different native indigenous societies where there are, two-spirit intersex people. Or I'm thinking here about other forms of anthropological work. For instance, today I had a chat with some folks in Indonesia. We're talking about translating more work by Bim Sutra, who is a Indonesian comrade who's in jail. But we translated his book, Anarchy in Alafuru, which looks at starting at stateless areas in Indonesia. And one of the moves it makes, I think, is really interesting is looking at sort of what happened that stateless forms of life in Indonesia would shift to becoming hierarchical after avoiding that for hundreds of years. And one of his arguments is basically the spice trade, right? And the spice trade being the moment when societies that were outside the state, outside of capitalist logic, all of a sudden found themselves embedded in a labor process in which there were some people who harvested, some people who did higher paid work. And these things, which were at first just sort of minor differences in like who's doing what work, over time sedimented into sort of hierarchies of status, which then sedimented into entire cultural categories, into categories of, no, no, I'm better than you because of this. So something which seems as sort of an economic labor process question actually then becomes a very much a sort of like a way of being in the world question. And how something like that where a form of life which for hundreds of years in Indonesia was resistant to the state and capitalism got brought in through not, like conquest, not through armies, but through clove the clove trade, right? Which in a way reminds me of someone like a son Rothal, where he talks about sort of the way which commodity forms become sort of like conscious categories of thought that are embedded deeply rather than just sort of like descriptive ones. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes, it's
Yes.
very good.
Mhm.
That wasn't a question. I fucked up. Um,
No, no.
yeah.
Great.
Good.
Yes.
Yeah,
And
very good.
Maybe I wanted to, I mean, I don't know if this is the right moment, but one of the things that caught my attention, the points you made, Stephen, today in the paper, the draft of, questions, points to be addressed, possibly. One of them, they are very important, very good, but this about the subject, if I may, I read what you write. You say Baudrillard famously argued that there is no revolutionary subject. Do you agree that the traditional figure of the revolutionary proletariat has dissolved? If there is no singular revolutionary subject, what replaces it? Networks, multitudes, forms of life. Maybe I wanted to address this point briefly
Go
and
for it.
then no, because I want to, in addition to the question of the revolutionary subject, it is the question of the subject that must be addressed as well. That, again, once again, I believe must be dismissed altogether, must be eliminated. So, what replaces the subject? That's, of course, a very important question, and I'm not saying that I have the answer to that. But certainly, this idea of, a multitude networks, you said, forms of life, forms of life. This is what, in a sense, we highlight, of course, even in the subtitle of our book, what it is to speak about forms of life, we say, forms of life, precisely considering the idea that we are in a world of flux, one might say, and I mean, being in the world is not being there in a static, an unchanging way, but it is always, being there in the sense of the flow of things, change, transformation, and so on, right? So these new forms of life are really free of any then superimposed form of governing life,
Mm.
which is then what makes things impossible. I mean, makes life impossible very often for many people. So the idea is, but if I may also bring Eugene into the conversation, because we are working on this question in a book we are writing together. And that right, Eugene, is it right? I mean, I can speak about that as well. I mean, the idea of first of all, we need to engage in a critique of the concept of the subject for sure that must be eliminated, just like the paradigm of subjectivity together with the paradigm of sovereignty must be completely eliminated. And also the concept of the multitude is very problematic, we say. And so in this book that we are writing, Coming Communism, the subtitle is Singularity and Contingency, we speak precisely about the wind, right? I mean, the wind and the many winds, right? And the idea of the gathering and the gathering of many gatherings that we consider to be a theoretical concept. It's not just a metaphor, right? But it is this idea of a constant transformation, which is, of course, I mean, it's not that, doesn't mean anything goes. There is a way of self-regulating one's own life. I mean, of course, there is a but it is this is what can actually maybe replace the subject and the revolutionary subject outside of ideological forms that very often then completely change the discourse and stifle not only political action, but daily actions, things such as what Richard was referring to in the sense of gender, and Richard, you referred to Kira Premin's work, but for example, in relation to gender, she does also speak of gender. I don't remember if that's the ninth, sorry, the nth degree. That there are many, many right possibility, many potentialities, many different ways of conceiving of something like gender, and many other, categories that those categories of identities that also must be exploited. There may be many ways in which life can be lived to the fullest, that potentialities can be developed. Very often, potentialities are not even allowed to, unfold and become what they can become, what they could be. Right. So this is what can happen outside of the paradigm of the subject and subjectivity, which is always a form of life which is subjected and subjugated. Right. So we had to exit this modality, right? So I don't know if that can offer any, no.
Well, I think that one of the limitations with specifying a revolutionary subject position is that revolutionary subject position is a historical contingency, and it too is subject to change. And so when you think with Marx about the real movement, I think one has always to leave open the possibility of insurgent subjectivities or subjectivities that announce themselves. The conceptualization of the multitude is an effort to deal with some of the limitations of the concept of the proletariat, but it is also, in a sense, an ideological framework into which everything would have to be poured. But I think insurgent subjectivities can take any possible form. Maybe we would call them all a part of the multitude or, somewhere in the world of many worlds. But when I think about philosophy from below, when I think about the revolt as as a a movement that answers the question, who are the subjects? And sometimes the question about who occupies the position of the revolutionary subject today is answered by the real movement, not by philosophy. And the role of the philosopher in some ways is to assume the position of one who can identify philosophical activity in activities of revolt, which is to say that we don't have to determine what the subject position is in a philosophical sense. We can see subjects when they announce themselves on the scene in moments of uprising, in moments of revolt, and then in that case we can try to unpack, what is the content. I mean, philosophers are there in the streets. They don't have to write texts or teach classes, but there is I think, dialectical relationship between what philosophers do when we throw into question the justice and the reality of the world, and what people do when they throw into question the justice and reality of deployments of federal agents in a city like Minneapolis. So when people rise up, it simply won't do to make some kind of an ideological reading of people resisting ICE in Minneapolis and say that they're all communists. I mean, this simply isn't true. But they are throwing into question the justice and the reality of the situation. This is precisely what philosophers have always done, albeit in a different way.
Where it gets complicated for me, and that's more interesting, is the subjects who announce themselves not to affirm being subjects, but who announce themselves in order to abolish themselves as subjects. So think of here about the working class revolt that seeks not to affirm the working class, but wants to revolt to get out of the subordinate position of being only working class, of only being a worker. Or the black revolt that doesn't want to affirm blackness, but wants to not be, who wants to forget that they are put in a position of being racialized as black, and wants to say just be without being overdetermined by that status. How would how could you think together? I mean, how would you think almost together like the subjective revolt of positions that are attempting to sort of almost abolish those positions? It seems to be immediately get into a sort of the bind here.
Well, I think, and I'll be brief on this, Bruno, but you can certainly complete the thought. But there's a beautiful section in Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. In the Grove edition, it was still called On Concerning Violence, in which Fanon talks about how the colonizer creates the native, right? And so he's thinking about Martinique, he's thinking about Algeria, and he's thinking about black struggles to get free from colonization, from coloniality, and the brutality of colonization. But when the colonizer shows up on the scene, all of a sudden the native is converted into the native. So the subject position is there to be abolished, right? I mean, I think in some sense too, when we think about Gaza and we think about the subject position of genocide, the subjects of genocide, as it were. The question is this a subject position to be retained and asserted in a new form of life, or is this a subject position to be completely exploded, to use Bruno's phrase, and to be abolished? Is it a subject position that belongs to a relation of coloniality that ultimately has to be completely destroyed? And so here too, I would just make the point that there is no ontological fixity of subjects, right? There is no, I mean, this is for us, I think, in some ways, the beating heart of communist ontologies. It's precisely to say that the indigenous becomes indigenous at the point of encounter with with the colonizers, with the imperialists, right? That these forms of life are, they're not trans-historical. They are themselves historical contingencies that have a birth date. And in the case of struggles for decolonization of the 20th century, we can talk about we could talk about sending them into the graveyard as well. I mean, there are these hopeful horizons, which were a crucial part of many, post-colonial liberation struggles of the 20th century. Not easy to do, but always, yeah, exactly what you say, Stephen, is that we don't accept the subject position. And the same thing is true, of course, in Marx with the proletariat. I mean, the ultimate horizon for Marx is to abolish the class as such, right? I mean, this is the ultimate horizon, and this is a problem in Marxist politics and Marxist philosophy. Is we don't want to be so wedded to these categorical concepts of the subject that we forget that we want to abolish them,
Right.
right? We don't want to reproduce them all of the time as if nothing has changed, as if insurgent subjectivities haven't announced themselves along other lines than the ones that Marx saw forming, in the 19th century. Um, and so I think, sometimes when people do this, and this is, I mean, I don't want to get into all of this part now, but there is a still raging debate. Um, in fact, it's raging right now, um, and it's in the Marxist milieu about, to what extent we abandon the concept of the proletariat, or we think about different compositional approaches to class analysis, or the relationship of class and identity and intersectionality and all of these things. Um, are just pregnant with controversies that Marxists can be pretty reactionary about sometimes. But I think that if we always remember what Bruno said, that becoming is inextricably linked to being, then we simply cannot go on asserting the revolutionary subject position of 160 years ago. We have to look and see what subject positions are asserting themselves, in what contexts. And oftentimes the horizon is the abolition of the subject as such.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, I mean, as you say, also the proletariat, I mean, that's the idea in Marx, that the abolition of all classes is ultimately also the dissolution and the abolition of the proletariat as a class. And so, I mean, if we use the word subject, also same idea. Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree. So, but that's the problem. That's what I see also in this, for example, discourse about the production of subjectivity and so on, right? That yes, I mean, of course, the colonizer will constitute the colonized as a subject, and so as you were very well describing. But then there shouldn't be a new constitution of a new subjectivity in turn. You know, it is again the explosion of this subjectivity, of this whatever cage, this box. I mean, it's something different. What this difference is maybe must be, um, invented. It's a matter of also the reinvention of things, but it's not to fall back into the paradigm of subjectivity. To me, that seems completely like undoing what one has done, right? I mean, it seems to me completely counterproductive from a revolutionary, radical point of view. Yeah, exactly. I agree. So
There
it
is
is. Mhm.
there is too a very nice example of this, what Bruno was just talking about in the case of the Zapatistas in Mexico, is that for a whole century there was the opposition of Indianismo to Indigenismo, and these were two different positions. The Indianismo was the assertion of the indigenous Mayan people of Mexico as the subject position, and to almost a kind of an ethnic conceptualization of ethnic or racial identity, of fixed ontology, if you will. Um, and indigenismo was the official policy of the Mexican government for nearly 100 years, which was the liquidation through miscegenation, through intergenerational, ethnic uh, uh, marriage and reproduction, that there would be an elimination of the ethnic identity of the Mayan Indian. And for over 70 years, these two things were opposed: the Indianismo ethnic identity of the subject of the Mayan indigenous versus the official policy of the Mexican government. And in the early 1990s, when the rebellion happened in 1994 of the Zapatistas, they broke from both of these positions in a very radical way and asserted what was called Zapatismo instead of Indianismo, was Zapatismo. And there was the famous line when they tried to unmask Marcos and reveal who was the philosophy professor from Mexico City, that, todos somos Marcos, is that we're all of us are all of us are Marcos. And the idea was that you could become a part of the movement of the indigenous people without some kind of an ethnic identity. And, the famous lines of the Zapatistas, that I'm a Palestinian in the West Bank, or I'm a woman in the subway at night, and so forth. This is very important. Also, an Iranian theorist, Hamid Dabashi, at Columbia University for many decades now, but he just published a book last year called After Savagery, which is about the situation in Gaza. And it's very interesting because he talks in that book about Palestinians who are not ethnically Palestinian, right? The people who are filmmakers and activists who are so deeply committed in an abiding and existential sense with the cause of the Palestinian people that they become Palestinian, right? And so it's a certain kind of Zapatismo around the issue of Israel-Palestine. And of course, Israel has their own version of that, right? It doesn't have to be some kind of a racially constructed ethnic identity. This is a very confusing conversation. It's, who's in and who's out. And what you're talking about is, on one hand, the explosion of subjectivities, but you're also talking about the that forms of becoming that really undermine previously fixed forms of being. I mean, and Debashi's argument is very controversial, and I think a lot of people would resist it. But he talks about a Danish woman who's a Palestinian by virtue of her many decades placing her life and body on the line for the cause of Palestinian liberation. It's remarkable, and I think in some ways the current participation of of anti-Zionist Jews, very powerful in the United States in the last 2 years, is also breaking down a certain subject position that, quite frankly, someone like myself is pretty shocked to see. And in the breaking down of the subjectivity of what it means to be Jewish after Gaza, um, there is something hopeful in this ontological unfixity. So the destabilization of previously fixed on top, they were presupposed or thought to be previously fixed ontologies. They never were, of course. They were always historical contingencies subject to change. But to see them actually changing, and this is what I want to say is concrete about the ontological approach to Marx and to communism, is that it gives many people hope for the possibility of a different future, that certain forms of life or forms of being in the world can actually be destabilized and become something else. And I think it is possible that in my own time, what it means to be Jewish will be fully decoupled with the Israeli state. It's possible. I don't say inevitable, but I see that there is a possibility, a horizontal possibility for this decoupling, which is important politically as
Yeah,
well as ontologically.
yeah, absolutely. And I think this is very important. And once again, it also belongs in not only in that logic of the subject, but certainly in it. And because it is a logic, a paradigm made of borders. I mean, it's about the border, whereas and the threshold is forgotten, right? But it is precisely also the border between the self and the other. I mean, as Arthur Rimbaud famously said by the poet, I is another, not I am another, I is another. So there is no, ultimately, these things are all constructed. So that the question is to destroy this fake, this false construction and invent something new. And this is, and we have a rich tradition. I mean, now comes to mind also, for example, the important right contribution philosophy of Giambattista Vico, quoted then in Marx, also in Capital. But things are made. And whatever is made can be unmade and made differently, right? I mean, so that's the sense of the philosophy of history for Vico, but it is the question of again life. I mean, of course, history is life, but everyday life, because otherwise, what is forgotten is what usually is considered marginal. Let's stay away from that. That's too far from us. Is famously. John Rawls, for example, said questioned about the problem of disability, right? I mean, these people are too far from us, right? No, I mean, as Joanna Hedva points out very importantly in her essay, Sick Woman Theory, right? I mean, speaking also about organization, which is still, again, once again, has to do with the logic of the subject, who is able to have access and who does not have access to forms of organization because of material conditions of life. And I completely agree when you always, Richard, you always point out the idea of the real movement in Marx's and Engels, no, in statement about, communism as the real movement that, abolishes the present state of things. It is this real movement, which is not ideological in form. It doesn't have to respect the borders which have been constructed in order to keep a form of a status quo precisely in order to make it impossible for forms of life to transform and be what they can be, not only what they are, but what they can be, right? The potentiality. So that's really the important thing that we had to consider. I mean, how to go about that. Of course, there are many ways, but it is really going back to the real movement precisely, and not any form of political organization. And I mean, I'm not saying that those structures are not important at all, but that may be a tool at one point, an instrument, and not the end, certainly, of not the goal of or not even the main process. The process is much richer, much more complex than what very often we believe when we think in terms of ideology, political movements, and so on and so forth.
It strikes me that when people express some sort of like almost like populist confusion with becoming, like, like the idea that like, what do you mean that you're now a Palestinian? Were you visited by the magical Palestinian fairy that waved a wand and made you Palestinian? Or people imagine that, like, what was her name? Rachel Dolezal. That one day she was visited by the fairy of blackness who waved the blackness wand and then made her black. And then they go, oh no, that doesn't make sense. That's silly. Because but you're missing all those processes of effective change, of social change, working with people, of developing connections. It's not like one day was someone goes, actually, I'm trans, like from zero to 100. There's usually a long process of feeling this, experiencing this, having to deal with that, working through it again and again and again. And the whole process of becoming isn't just sort of like a once and done thing, but it's this over time material psychological cultural thing which happens. But if you ignore that, then it just seems kind of ridiculous, right? Because like, how could the one thing become another thing? That's
Ye-
insane.
Yeah, and I think a crucial a crucial point here, which just has to be added, is that there is a risk that somebody could listen to this conversation and think that Bruno and I, by talking about being, becoming, and subjectivity, are thinking about what each person can become as some kind of a individual, which is a concept that Bruno's work throws completely into question, raising it flat completely to the ground. The question of singularity, the question of individuality. But the crucial point I would make, though, is that we're not talking about the becoming of individual persons.
Hmm.
We're talking also about, and this I think is a crucial point from a communist point of view, we're talking about the possibility that the society could become something other than what it is, not just the people within it. So, I mean, very important for both Bruno and I is the question of disability. And if someone is listening to this conversation and knows somebody or has experience with severe cognitive or neurological disabilities, they could draw the wrong conclusion that, we are saying something like, everybody can become what they want to be without limitations, and that there's no, that human flourishing is just the sky's the limit, like some kind of a neoliberal dream of, make yourself into what you want to be. And this is exactly not what we're talking about. So, very important to Bruno's work and increasingly important to mine is the work of the philosopher Eva Kittay. And she talks, about her experiences in a very personal way and philosophical way with her daughter. And it's quite clear that the problem isn't that her daughter ought to become something other than what she is. The problem is the social and political reality has to be radically transformed. And what we think, I think, and Bruno can correct me if I'm misrepresenting it, but I believe, and Kate does mention, even though she isn't a Marxist, and she really distances herself from seeing what I think are fairly obvious communist contents in her work, her philosophical work. But she does mention the famous line when thinking about disability from the critique of the Gotha program, from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. And so, obviously, when Marx was talking about this horizontal banner that we could hang on the future from each according to their ability to each according to their needs, he wasn't describing the society such as it is. He was describing a completely different society in which people with very severe disabilities would have a different form of life, not because they have become something other than something else, which isn't to say that becoming is impossible for people with disabilities, but oftentimes I think it's crucial, and from a communist point of view, must be emphasized that when we're talking about a different form of life, sometimes the problem isn't the transformation of the lives, but the transformation of the material conditions of life, the transformation of the social and the political reality in which people find themselves. So we wouldn't ever want to say, for example, that we should accept the kind of propagandistic racist logic of the Israeli ideology that says, well, you should have raised your children differently. They should become something else. Like you should teach them differently about the Jews in Israel and so forth. And that the problem is that they need to become different when by the time they're 15, they shouldn't be willing to join Hamas or something like that. And it would be just as absurd to look in Tehran and say, well, these people should do this differently. They should celebrate in a different way about Khamenei and so forth. They should respond differently. Obviously, the way that people are in the world is is inextricably linked to how the world is. I mean, and so what we are talking about is human becoming, human flourishing. We are talking about human possibility, existing forms of life and new forms of life, but we're also, at the same time, we insist that the world such as it is has to be radically transformed for these flourishings to be possible. And so what has to become what it isn't is the world. Within the limits of the capitalist reality, there are many things that are simply impossible. Right? That doesn't mean that they are impossible. It only means that they're impossible within the limits of the capitalist reality.
Good,
No,
but maybe if
I
the
mean,
others want to also, sorry, join the discussion, yes, um, you want to say no? Nino, Eugene, Abe, hi, Abe. Haven't seen you in a long time, but right? Yeah.
Oh, okay, I'll try. For this
Mhm.
moment, I just want to suggest a thinking experiment. So I want to say one story. So like there was once a king named Midas whose ears had somehow turned into those of a donkey ears. The
Mhm.
fact that his ears were those of donkey was kept as a strict secret at that time. However, King's barber alone knew the truth. The barber desperately wanted to reveal the secret, but he could not do so because he feared the king. So one day he dug a hole in the ground and whispered the secret into it. Later, reeds grew from the spot, and whenever the wind blew through them, a sound could be heard. The king has donkey's ears. So, in this story, who is the subject that reveals the truth and challenges the king's power? I think I want to talk about this, and for this moment, I think it can be helpful for this discussion, I think.
Yeah, it is a moment of insurgency, insurrection. I mean, insurgency, and yes, it's a revolutionary, or challenging all powers, you say, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Right.
Is the subject the wind?
Maybe, but it's a subjectless. Wind.
Objectless wind, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So the others, Nino, Alvin.
Yeah, I wanted to ask either or both of you whether you're familiar with Nick Toburn's concept of the proletarian unnameable. I always thought that was an interesting formulation. You might think of it as sort of a non-identitarian mode of composition. In its very open-endedness, it offers almost a way of escaping identitarian categories that you were talking about before. I think it refuses the specification that might fix subjects ontologically. And at the same time, though, it preserves some very open-ended notion of the proletariat, at least as a disposition or as, I don't know, a collective orientation, if not as a category. So I think in that sense, it's attractive and maybe compatible with your project here.
I
Yeah.
agree.
No, I wasn't familiar with that. What's the name again of the author?
Proletarian unnameable.
Proletarian name of, okay. I will check it out. Yeah. Yes, certainly. Very interesting. Yeah.
Uh, um, 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 is that from his Marx Deleuze politics book? Or is it from somewhere else?
Yeah. I think I don't know if he's still using that concept, but it's from his, I guess, his first book from 2002, give or take.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
It's a nice reference because I actually stole the phrase minor composition from that book. So
Yeah. Wow. Mm-hmm.
maybe didn't steal it, borrowed it.
Okay. So it's in Deleuze, Marx, and politics, I think. Okay. Interesting. Yeah, and speaking about Stephen, also this minor, right, thing, minor compositions. We had been talking about with Eugene also in the book we are writing of this idea of a minor ontology, precisely, of course, related to Deleuze. I don't think Deleuze uses that himself, but it's been used with in relation to him. But this is what we need, right? Which is precisely to go back to what we were saying before, where being and becoming meet in, as then Richard, you put it in an inexplicable way, right? It's a minor, not the ontology of being, but like minor, precisely that of the accident, the margins, the unnameable, if you will, yes. That's what we should focus on. Mhm.
Mm. I mean, what I
Because
could do, you know,
no, I will. You can go ahead. I just wanted to add something to. No, see,
okay.
because you said being and becoming. I was thinking about that before when you talked about it, and maybe you said so. I don't know whether explicitly, but
Mm.
that being is becoming. Basically, you're saying, right?
Mhm. Mm.
Because there is no, I mean, being is just, I mean, it's, what is it, this static thing? I mean, it's even in
Yeah,
terms of, I mean, existentially, there is nothing that just is, right? There is no, that's the
right.
idea. We can see this in, well, even time, but
Yeah,
everything else, even
no, I was
things.
thinking, about that. We
Ah,
can say about time. Yeah, I was thinking about your work also about time and the aspect of time that you work on from
yeah.
linguistics. Yeah. Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's important. Maybe being should be, I mean, of course we need, but just as you critique the idea of subject, but being should also be, no, critiqued because maybe it's just becoming. There is no being per se, but only,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Everything
exactly.
becomes. Yeah.
Yeah.
because it's also the idea of the difference between just the state itself, because being would be a state. We use that, it's actually even as a stative verb, but it's all eventive, if anything, right? To use the opposite of stative. So everything becomes, right? I thought that's important. Yeah. Even so, we use be maybe not in the wrong way, but in a kind of maybe without really thinking. I mean, I don't think that people understand what be means or what it's supposed to mean, because there is no right being per se, right?
So what if the Beatles, instead of writing Let It Be, should have written Let It Become?
Maybe,
Yeah.
yeah,
Right.
maybe.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I agree completely, Nino, with what you've just
Mm.
said, but would only point out, um, and this I think highlights the importance of your observation, that the entire criminal justice system of the world is is grounded on being in the sense of an ontological fixity. That the At the current time that we're having this conversation, I'm at the end of my second time teaching a course in a maximum security prison on prison abolition. But I've got a few more weeks left, and you're talking about inmates there who who's who've been there since the early 1980s, who have multiple life sentences. You're not talking about people who are wrongfully convicted for the most part. That does exist in every carceral system. It does exist, wrongful conviction and exoneration, but you are also talking about people who've done something awful. But how do you get there? Um, Gone is any deep, sustained attention to becoming. Gone is it's all fixed at the point of an act. And 30 or 40 years later, in a cell with no freedom, with almost no opportunities to support human flourishing or becoming, the whole justification is to say, well, there was this thing that you did, really awful thing that you did in 1987, and it's an awful thing, and it's not a wrongful conviction, and you're fixed at that point. So what you're talking about is that all being is already becoming, and that in a sense that there is no being as such, because being is already a becoming, and it's already on its way out the door. So, but
Yeah,
the point is, but the point is that this observation you're making, which on some level seems very obvious, is also one of the most subversive ideas you can articulate. It completely, um, it's completely at odds with the whole system of mass incarceration in the US and elsewhere, which relies on this insistence that you are nothing more than the worst thing you did in 1987. And I would point out too that when I go in there to teach, um, there are many people inside who have fought against that. They don't want this, they don't want these opportunities to go into the prison. First of all, the point is, well, how should they did something awful in 1987. So how should they have any access to any form of, you know, uh, of human development or thinking and becoming and so forth?
I mean,
Yeah.
that's
Richard, like
mm,
this is kind of like the entire plot of Les Miserables, right? Like for Inspector Javert, Jean Valjean can only be the criminal who is defined by the act of criminality, and anything which like can never change or be anything else other than that. And the point when after years and years finally demonstrates that he's in fact not the same person, that leads to Javert actually just killing himself because he can't process it. He can't
Right,
deal with becoming. So the agent of the state chooses to self-abolish rather than acknowledge becoming.
right. Yeah, and I mean the concept of the penitentiary was based on the religious idea of penitence. And so I mean, its idea is that you're supposed to be able to cleanse yourself of wrongdoing. That's been abolished by the carceral system. It's been completely abolished. The penitentiary, at the very least, did have some respect for this ontological insight about becoming. But you're right, Les Miserables, which I keep hearing was Ayatollah Khomeini's favorite novel. But you're right. There has to be another side. There has to be a way to escape the mark of wrongdoing. Um, and there is another side, but the system, such as it is incapable of recognizing it, and that's why it does have to be abolished. And that's why all of the students that I have inside of the prison are prison abolitionists. It's not just because they live there and will, in many cases, die there, but it's because they understand that it's completely antithetical to a different form of life. The same sort of demand that the system imposes upon the inmate, which is that you should have been somebody else, it refuses.
Right, and it's interesting because this is, and then ultimately any punitive logic is based on this ontology of violence, whereby becoming is not completely altogether forgotten. But they say, for example, right, because in 1987 you did that awful thing, now you can become X, and there is no exit. There is no possible transformation anymore. There is no becoming. Becoming is stopped at that moment, right? So that's a very there is a lot of violence at the ontological level right there, right? Time stops, right? And you can no longer exit that time frame, right? So that's very interesting too, I believe,
But
because
that's why no finish.
no, no, okay.
No, many times in prison, people hurt themselves because they cannot. Things kind of stopped, but they still want to change, to keep becoming. So there are people who cut off their fingers or other things, and they hurt themselves really badly, precisely because they want to somehow keep becoming.
Mhm.
Yes, and there's a religious dimension to that as well.
Mhm.
And in small cellular seclusion where you have no opportunities, there is also an increased attraction to a metaphysical becoming, and I would say with that as well, philosophy. So the prison is one of the only places I teach philosophy in which one never has to respond to the very stupid question that Kant already answered in the 18th century, that, but that may be true in theory, but it isn't true in practice. You remember Kant was quite infuriated by this old saw that is still often brought out to people like Bruno and I, probably in our respective university settings, but not in a prison. There's nothing abstract about human freedom in a prison. There's nothing like too impractical or immaterial or overly philosophical about human becoming and human flourishing. In a place like that, it's concrete. It's about as real as it gets. And the attraction to a transformative politics and ontological possibilities for different forms of life, it's more than just a mere ideological attraction. It's an existentially necessary part of surviving. You talk about the people who hurt themselves. This is very real. And they have a whole set of provisions in the prison. When this happens, there's segregation and 24-hour monitoring. and so forth. So that the sense of possibility is really foreclosed for a lot of people, and where I think the point of contact with philosophy, and also with religion and other forms of metaphysics, is much more concretely ontologically liberating.
Yeah, but I think it's also because when they hurt themselves and so they feel, the flesh and they see the blood, and so they feel that they're still alive. Otherwise, they're called often dead souls, right? So basically, people died in a way, right? So they somehow want to become alive again, be alive. But yeah.
Yes, I agree. I agree.
Mhm. So we should probably start nudging not towards a conclusion, but towards a pause for the evening. So maybe I'll just ask like maybe like one more thing, and then we'll maybe call it a day. And that's if you're thinking about that wanting to feel alive, the wanting to feel a becoming, not just for people who are most literally confined and stuck, but what are the sort of places where you see or forms you see emerging that sort of, like where you see that happening elsewhere or most sort of like, are most that are like resonant at the moment.
Oh,
Sorry.
no, go ahead.
Oh, Bruno
No,
is,
no, no,
yeah.
no. No, you
No,
can.
no.
No, if you want to
Okay.
say something.
No, I didn't want to say anything. I was going to ask for clarifications, but
Uh,
mm,
yeah, no, I mean, one way of, that's a very interesting point, of course, and maybe I answer in a simple, simplistic way. I don't know, but I mean, it's difficult to say, but maybe these new forms can be seen. Let's say that maybe the way in which people, act and interact should change, at the level of, we can link this to the question of the human, what it is to be humanity. That was another point that you made, Stephen. I mean, at the level of like contemporary politics, I don't know, since I am in New York, but we all know we all live through this. I would say that, like a figure, for example, I want to say this, a figure like Zoran Mamdani is an exceptional figure in that sense, showing, a new way of, not simply doing things politically, but also relating, in a fresh, if you will, way at the human level with people and understanding, evidently, from what he says, what he does, what's really important in life, what is dear to people in a general sense at the universal level, right? And I think that this shows a different modality of doing things, where a situation in which language changes, in which there is, things are said in a firm way, but without conceding to the forms of violence that usually are, seen as necessary in order to do, like to engage in politics or do something of the kind, right? I mean, so I mean, it is a reinvention of life at the level of relationality, the way in which we relate to one another, understanding, really grasping the importance of the meaning of interdependence, right? How we are all right in a situation of mutual, of mutuality with one another. I mean, this interdependence is real. I mean, it's very often and certainly, as we know, typically the sovereign individual of the neoliberal tradition is the opposite of that. But that's completely fictional, right? So to understand how by really living according to this mode of interdependence, and I don't know, I don't want to be oversimplistic, but maybe even being nice, I mean, because many people say, yeah, but political science is not about being, what do you mean it's not about being nice? It is also about that. I mean, respecting oneself, respecting the others, understanding, the fact that being in the world is a difficult situation, a difficult journey. It is a task that we all have to take seriously, right? And try to be in the world, right? Collectively, individually, but collectively, in the best possible way, right? Human flourishing and so on and so forth. But that is not impossible precisely. It is a real concrete possibility, even at the level of the imagination. It is possible to imagine a different way of living together, which is not based on violence, but based on other things, solidarity, love, friendship, and so on and so forth. Why not? It is possible. It is the ideology and the dominant ideologies today, they say, no, it's not possible because you need war, you need violence, you have to kill this and that, and so on and so forth. But this is completely made up. It's completely stupid also, in addition to every other thing, right? So we had to really reinvent that and the concrete imagination. I mean, of course, imagination can be then it's not wishful thinking, imagination can become completely abstract, but the concrete imagination of which, say, Kierkegaard speaks, for example, right? I mean, in the dialectic between the necessary and the possible, the finite and the infinite, and so on and so forth, there is this concrete imagination that can bring about new forms of life, forms of life in which, uh, notwithstanding the difficulties that are there objectively in life anyway for everybody, that make things, better for everybody, right? That make
Also,
flourishing. Yeah. Oh, okay.
um, no, the Ubuntu theory, which is close to a case theory after
Yeah,
all,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, you could say
Interdependence.
Ubuntu. Yes, I'm more. Yeah.
Ubuntu, no?
Yeah. Which is I am because
Mm.
you are.
Ubuntu,
I
Ubuntu,
am.
Gabantu.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I am because of and through the other people. Otherwise, I wouldn't be simply. So that's. But I don't know, Stephen, if I address
No,
the.
no, no, no. It's good. I mean, I like the way that in Mamdani's inauguration speech, he literally talked about the warmth of collectivism, but the collectivism he talked about wasn't a sort of homogenous insular collectivism. It was a collectivism that was welcoming of things coming out of Africa, from the Mideast, from everywhere. Was a cosmopolitan welcoming collectivism. I remember I really like this interview with him where he's this happens right before the Africa Cup of Nations. And he's talking about football, and he's being asked to like his favorite players, and he mentions like, like JJ Okocha, this like Nigerian guy playing in England, but then he talks about like, oh yeah, I like Mohamed Salah because there's a halal cart named after him in the Bronx, and it was just this way that connects all these different things. It's in such an approachable way that he's talking about geopolitics, but he's
Mhm.
talking about it in a way that is actually like funny and human and relatable and not. It was just yeah, the way he does it is just wonderful.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Mm.
Yeah, oh, by the way, my son loves Mohammed Salah, but the um, the book that we wrote together is based on a conversation about the other books that we wrote
Mm.
apart. Um, so one of the books that didn't get discussed in Communist Ontologies was a book I wrote called Imaginary Power, Real Horizons, because it was published around the same time as Communist Ontologies in the fall of 2024. Um, but in that book, I try to actually look at the materiality of imaginary power in real historical movements and concrete struggles for human freedom. And just to take one example that plays an important role for me, um, I go into the beautiful little book by W.E.B. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folk, and which is really a book about music. Every single chapter opens with music, but he writes about the sorrow songs of the slaves. And he writes about the slaves singing about a freedom they do not have, how they are in the fields and they are abused and miserable and singing, singing songs that Du Bois loved as a child. He learned the songs and he loved them as a child. The book was published in 1906. And he talks about the importance of the imagination of the slave for a possible freedom on the horizon that doesn't yet exist, that the slaves themselves would have no reason to think would come to pass. So the imagination for a slave and a slave revolt is not some mere immaterial, merely philosophical substance, if you will. It is intimately connected to the freedom struggles of the slaves. And I would argue that the imagination um, is at work in Black Lives Matter. It's at work right now in the streets of Tehran, and it has to be somehow enlivened in Gaza for there to be a possibility other than what is. There has to be some imaginary capabilities that are then connected to real movements, as we call them. So, on the one hand, there's what you want to see, and then on the other hand, there's what there is. In some ways, I'm the most conventionally Marxist when you ask me what I want to see. I want to see mass mobilizations. I want to see Minneapolis turn into ungovernable strikes across the country that bring the Trump administration to its knees. I want to see working class rebellions and movements in occupied factories. But then there's what you do see. And unfortunately, when you move from what you'd like to see to what's actually happening, you do have to try to appreciate smaller things. It's either that or it's the deepest depths of cynicism, which many Marxists didn't survive as Marxists. They became something else. There's a whole lot of history on that. So you have to be able to find communist hope in smaller things than the things you might like to see. So one of the books I wrote is called The Communism of Love, and it's looking into um, relationships that we have that do not follow the logic of capitalist exchange relations. You're looking at values other than exchange values. And in a way, Bruno and I always go back to this. He wrote this book, Bruno did, as we mentioned, Labor of Fire, which I'm reading now for the fourth time. I'm working on a book now called Revolution and Improvisation. But at the end of this book, which is really a critique of the capitalist form of labor and life, and the subtitle of the book is The Ontology of Labor Between Economy and Culture. So he was already, at this point, Bruno was already thinking about ontological possibility. And he juxtaposes to productive labor, living labor, or the other things that we do that have different values to us than capitalist exchange value. So sometimes you have to look at people who make music that no one pays for. You have to look at people who make art that few people see. You have to think about people who write books that almost no one reads, but when they're being written with this imaginary audience that you hope will find them. And what I always thought was so shocking and beautiful about about Bruno's book about labor, Labor of Fire, is in the last paragraph, the last words of the book, spoiler alert, but if you haven't read it yet, that's your fault. He writes, if artworks are the product of artistic social labor with the elimination of productive labor, which dominates society but is really antisocial, the return of labor to itself will make possible the constitution of a society where the work of art prevails as its most common element and feature. This is beautiful, what Bruno writes at the end of Labor of Fire. He's talking about what John Holloway calls other doing. You know, the things that we do for other reasons than money, The things that we do for other reasons than capital, we have to keep doing those things. And we have to carve out the space and the time to do the things that have values that are not capitalist exchange values. And we have to set up the barricades around those things and keep on doing them. And we also have to then wait patiently for the big things that we as Marxists always wished to see.
Right.
Well, that is
Right.
an excellent thing to end on. Building the barricades around other doing, as we wait for other build to other things. But thank you very much, both of you. All of you for coming along.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. It was nice.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah.
Yes.
A real pleasure.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Stephen.
everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Richard. Okay.